I'd like to remind everybody that the 10th edition of the International Conference on Frailty and Sarcopenia Research will be held from March 11th to the 13th, 2020 in Toulouse, France. This meeting has become the premier meeting for frailty and sarcopenia researchers worldwide, and I hope you will agree with me that this meeting really offers the best in basic biological studies, clinical studies, and translational studies in the areas of frailty and sarcopenia research. So I hope you can join us in Toulouse in March for this exciting meeting. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Matteo Cesari from the University of Milan in Milan, Italy. His presentation is entitled Sarcopenia, From Research to Clinical Practice. Dr. Cesari.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Matteo Cesari. I'm Associate Professor of Geriatrics at the University of Milan and the head of the Geriatric Unit at the Ospedale Maggiore Policlinico in Milan, in Italy. The title of the presentation is Sarcopenia from Research and to Clinical Practice. Why we talk about sarcopenia? Sarcopenia is an extremely relevant condition of old age that has attracted the interest of clinicians and researchers over the last years, and there's a story that started at the end of the 80s. At the end of the 80s, in a meeting in Albuquerque, Erwin Rosenberg discussed about the need of better considering the skeletal muscle decline as a phenomenon of aging. It was evident that the shrinkage of the skeletal muscle is something that is occurring to every living species, so that this condition may serve as special benchmark for the study of aging, and at the same time the skeletal muscle decline occurring with aging is also responsible for major health-related negative outcomes, including disability, hospitalization, institutionalization, mortality. So there was a clinical relevance that was not sufficiently captured by the scientific community because of the lack of a name. It is there, it is evident, but there was a name missing for better defining and better standardizing the language. Erwin Rosenberg, at the end of the 80s, proposed the term sarcopenia, from the Greek sarx, flesh, and penia, loss. As I said, sarcopenia is a universal phenomenon. This is a simple example of sarcopenia in the Cernoabditis elegans, a small worm that is commonly used in aging research. So it's really a matter of special interest for translational research and for testing the interventions on aging. How sarcopenia looks like. Phenotypically, we have the skeletal muscle shrinkage, so the person may have thinner lower limbs characteristically. When we see the skeletal muscle decline at the imaging, for example, as in this case the MRI, we note a substantial decline of the light gray area from a young healthy person to an old still healthy individual, and at the same time a substantial increase of the darker gray that is representing the adipose tissue. These are MRI of the calf, of the thigh, and as you can see, the adipose tissue in the older person is substantially larger, and also infiltrates of fat are present inside of the muscle, potentially impacting on the quality of the muscle and on its function. Sarcopenia is a universal phenomenon present across species, and also in humans, sarcopenia is present independently of comorbidities. Usually the skeletal muscle tends to decline in its quality and quantity after the age of 40. There might be diseases that more than others are impacting on its quality and quantity, but however, every one of us after the age of 40 starts declining in the skeletal muscle mass and function. In order to include the sarcopenia in the research setting and in the clinical practice, multiple operational definitions have been developed and validated over years. This is perhaps the first operational definition that was published in 1998 by Richard Baumgartner, and is a definition that is largely focused on the quantification of the muscle mass. So the skeletal muscle quantity was the primary parameter for defining the sarcopenic condition. Nevertheless, in 2010-2012, several different consensus papers were published in the literature by independent group of researchers and clinicians, and in this slide are summarized the four that had a larger diffusion. As said, these are four different groups of researchers and clinicians. All of them defined sarcopenia in a different way. The only aspect that was consistently present in the four definitions was that sarcopenia was proposed to be defined in a bidimensional way, that is, capturing, of course, the amount of skeletal muscle present in the person, so the quantity of skeletal muscle, but at the same time, every one of the four consensus papers included the assessment of a muscle quality, muscle strength, muscle performance dimension. In other words, it was felt by all the four consensus groups that the muscle quantity alone was not adequately capturing the inner nature of sarcopenia, that is, a skeletal muscle decline both in terms of quantity but also of function. The most commonly known of the four consensus papers was the one conducted by Alfonso Cruz-Gentov within the European Geriatric Medicine Society. In this consensus paper was provided also a diagnostic algorithm for sarcopenia, in which the entry door was the slow gait speed. In the presence of the slow gait speed, there was an assessment of muscle mass via DEXA or bioimpedentiometry, CT scan or MRI, in order to distinguish those who are sarcopenic from those who are not. It is important to see in this slide, gait speed is here, the very entry door, and it anticipates the quantification of the muscle mass. Muscle strength as a collateral pathway is measured only in person with good gait speed in order to recover potential false negative persons at the sarcopenic persons at the gait speed. The bidimensional definition of sarcopenia has created over the years a lot of discussions and problems because nesting the two dimensions, the quantity and the quality of the muscle within the same concept, implicitly make them very similar and provide them the same specific weight in the clinical relevance of the condition, and this is not true for different reasons. First of all, because the skeletal muscle size tend to decline in a less steep way compared to the muscle strength and muscle power, and also because strength, power, muscle performance are more clinically relevant both for the patient but also because more strongly predictive of negative endpoints, including disability, including mortality. So the coexistence of these two souls of sarcopenia within the same definition has always been somehow problematic because there are different priorities. This is perhaps the reason why the foundation of the National Institute of Health Sarcopenia Project, when proposed a gender specific cut points for muscle weakness and appendicular limb mass, try to stay away from putting them together in one only construct, but prefer to present as much as possible the two dimensions in an independent and separate way. More recently, and we are talking about the beginning of this year, the European Geriatric Medicine Society, with its special interest group coordinated by Alfonso Cruz-Gentov, published a revised version of the operational definition of sarcopenia. What has changed over these last years? First of all, it is striking that sarcopenia is today defined as a disease, as a muscle disease. So it is there has been a move, a shift from something that was more syndromic condition towards something that has a more nosological background. Another major change resides on the algorithm, in the diagnostic algorithm that has been proposed. The algorithm at the very beginning, in the original version, had the gait speed as the entry door. Here we find screening tools, questionnaires such as the SARC-F, a 5-item questionnaire that is very easy to implement in the clinical setting, even in primary care, that are identifying potential candidates for further testing, in particular muscle strength. So now there is not the gait speed as an entry door, but there is a screening, a questionnaire, and then the assessment of skeletal muscle via hand grip strength or chair stand test. Persons with muscle weakness are then driven towards the quantification of the skeletal muscle using one of the many different techniques that we have today available, such as DEXA, bioimpedentiometry analysis, CT scan, or MRI. It depends on the setting. Once that the sarcopenia is defined on the basis also of the imaging, then the physical performance that in the original version was the entry door of the diagnostic algorithm is now used for quantifying the severity of the condition. It has been discussed over the last year very often whether sarcopenia is ready for being included in the clinical setting, whether this is only a research condition. Now, there is large agreement that sarcopenia is a clinically relevant condition, is a condition that is part of the geriatric practice, should be measured at every contact with the older person, and studies like this suggest that we are already in the position for capturing the typical phenotypic signs of sarcopenia, because physicians indeed are already testing muscle mass, muscle strength and physical performance during their daily routine. Of course, in an heterogeneous way, because multiple operational definitions are available and there is still a controversy about which is the best one. But on the other hand, the physicians have already identified in the skeletal muscle decline an important feature of the older patient and identify this condition as clinically relevant to be assessed. in order to facilitate the implementation of sarcopenia in the clinical setting, there are consensus papers like this that have been published over the last years, in which authors have provided suggestions on how to measure muscle mass, muscle strength, and physical performance. Interestingly, in this consensus paper, recommendations are stratified according to the setting where sarcopenia is assessed, implying that it is evident that sarcopenia cannot be measured on the same way from primary care to the research setting, but there might be the need of being flexible in terms of the methodology to be adopted, because resources, priorities, and the details of interest might differ from case to case. So, for example, in the assessment of muscle mass, whereas DEXA, MRI, or CT scan are more easily applicable in the research setting, they might be unfeasible in primary care, where the obsolete, the so often considered obsolete anthropometry may instead find a certain role. Similarly, for the assessment of muscle strength, we may find relatively easy to measure the hand grip strength in the primary care as well as in the research settings, because the dynamometer is a relatively easy to find and use instrument. Other tests might be more complex or not so informative for the specific purposes of the setting. Same thing for the many different physical performance tests that we have developed over the year, and that from case to case and setting to setting may play a different role. In this consensus paper, interestingly, the authors have also provided a table entitled the red flag method, in order to train physicians, in particular primary care physicians, at the recognition of those signs and symptoms that are frequently reported and presented by older persons, but that are not yet taken into account, adequately taken into account in the clinical practice, because perhaps overseen, or perhaps because considered as part of normal part of the aging, whereas these signs and symptoms, conditions, may indeed reflect the clinical manifestation of underlying sarcopenia, for which we should do something. Interestingly, there are two different ways of looking at sarcopenia. There is one approach that tends to see sarcopenia as a kind of geriatric syndrome, so a complex system of signs, symptoms, and conditions heterogeneously related to each other that are contributing to this clinical manifestation. If we accept sarcopenia as a geriatric syndrome, then we accept an heterogeneity in its biological background, in its pathophysiological pathway, so that sarcopenia may become the entry door for a comprehensive geriatric assessment, in order to disentangle the different health deficits, understand the reasons, the causes of the skeletal muscle decline, and provide to the patient a specific personalized intervention. Over the past years, this approach, though it remains valid and commonly used, has also been paralleled by the idea that sarcopenia is a disease. In 2016, a new ICD-10 code has been published for sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is indeed a nosologic condition and a disease to treat as hypertension or COPD. The problem is that we have not yet specific interventions targeting the skeletal muscle decline other than lifestyle modifications, and this impacts on the clinical implementation of sarcopenia in the daily practice. To fill this gap, and in order also to promote research on pharmacological interventions against sarcopenia. The Innovative Medicine Initiative funded in 2014 the Sarcopenia and Physical Frailty in Older People Multi-Component Treatment Strategies project, sprinty. This is a 48 million euro project funded by public-private sources. There is the European Commission, there is EFPIA, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associates, that have provided this budget to a European consortium composed by 20 different partners in order to provide a definition of sarcopenia, an operational definition of sarcopenia that can be acceptable by regulatory agencies. So something that is, so a clinical condition that is for sure prevalent in the general population, that is clinically relevant, that is amenable of modifications and being treated, and also that relies on a very specific and unique pathophysiological pathway based and focused on a specific muscle. For this reason, during the first phase of the project, the researchers, on the basis of existing literature, provided a new definition, operational definition of sarcopenia, of physical frailty and sarcopenia, according to the terminology that was used in the call for the project, and this new definition was defined according to three key criteria: a short physical performance battery impairment, that is a score ranging between 3 and 9, the presence of sarcopenia, that is low appendicular limb mass assessed via DEXA, and the absence of mobility disability, that is the participants had to be, these persons had to be capable of walking 400 meters within 15 minutes. In other words, the population that is defined by this construct is excluding persons who are robust and persons who are disabled, because the primary outcome of for treating physical frailty and sarcopenia is the prevention of disability, especially disability in the mobility. This construct that I've here very briefly summarized, but you have the reference here for going in the rationale of all the specific items, has been presented to the European Medicine Agency, so the regulatory agency for medications, for drugs in Europe, before the beginning of the trial. Once that the EMA approved the construct, that definition of physical frailty and sarcopenia was used for recruiting 1,500 older persons, community-dwelling older persons, across Europe. All these persons, therefore, participating in a randomized controlled trial, were physically frail and presented the characteristics of sarcopenia in the absence of mobility disability. The 1,500 participants have been divided into groups according to the study design. One group, the control group, was following regular seminars and educational material on healthy aging and lifestyle. The intervention group was undergoing a multi-component program composed by physical activity interventions, physical exercise classes twice per week for the entire duration of the study. There was a nutritional component of the intervention that was based on the assessment of the diet of the participants, nutritional counseling, and eventual intervention on the deficits and deficiencies that were identified with the support of health technologies. The study is at the very end. The follow-up will be completed in the next few weeks. To date, only the baseline characteristics of the sample population have been published in the literature. As you can see from this descriptive table, the population is quite old, 78 years, almost 79 years of age. The study, the project, the participants, the partners of the project were able to recruit more participants than what was originally planned, more than 1,500 participants, so that, I mean, as to show that the population indeed exists. It's a real world population. And interestingly, this is a population that is relatively in a good functional status. The ADL and IADL that are traditionally used to measure the functional status of the older person are relatively preserved. So these are autonomous persons in their daily life, but still they present a significant physical impairment, as seen in the 6.7 SPPB, mean SPPB score, or the 0.7 meter per second at the 4 meter gait speed test. So these are persons who are non-disabled but physically impaired. It is also interesting to see that these persons were relatively overweight, thus confuting the idea that a sarcopenia is only present in lean, cachectic persons. Persons with obesity, persons who are overweight, might be at high risk of presenting also sarcopenia, a sarcopenia that is hidden behind a large amount of adipose tissue. What will be the contribution of the SPRINT project in the future? SPRINT is providing the basis of this pyramid. It is testing this novel construct, this novel definition of sarcopenia with in terms of to reverse the risk profile for disability with lifestyle intervention, physical exercise and nutrition mainly. When the study will be over, we will see whether this condition is reversible or not, and at the same time we will be able also to identify the non-responders to this intervention. The non-responders to the intervention, as occurring for any other nosologic condition, will then be the target population for a second step, for a second level intervention, drugs. When we have a person with diabetes, we first modify the lifestyle, we promote physical exercise, we promote nutrition, and if this is not successful, we proceed with the prescription of hypoglycemic medications. The same construct is in the head of the research, in the SPRINT researchers. We start providing the first evidence that the physical frailty and sarcopenia condition is a nosological condition with a clinical manifestation, a specific biological background, and signs and symptoms characterizing its presence. And then, once that we have tested the reversibility of the condition, we may have those to address towards second line interventions. And we are not talking about a very far future, because pharmacological agents to treat sarcopenia are already in the pipeline of many pharmaceutical industries. There are many molecules at different phases of the testing, so that in the future we may have specific drugs directly targeting the skeletal muscle decline. In conclusion, the concept of sarcopenia has been evolving over time. At the very beginning, there was the pure assessment of the skeletal muscle alone. Then it has been realized that the quality of the skeletal muscle in terms of function, strength is also important and provides the clinical relevance to this condition. Now we have bidimensional definitions, we have several bidimensional definitions, and the clinical research community that are ready to implement them in their daily practice. Depending on the context, we may have sarcopenia structured and seen as a geriatric syndrome, so under a more public health perspective may represent the entry door towards comprehensive geriatric assessment, personalized care, in order to open geriatric services devoted to the older persons, in order to identify the causes of sarcopenia, the heterogeneity and complexity of the older persons, and provide multidimensional interventions. On the other hand, over the past few years, sarcopenia has growingly been considered also as an independent, standalone disease. There is work conducted in order to frame it according to the requirements of regulatory agencies, in order to arrive in the next future at having it as a target condition for pharmacological interventions. I close my presentation reminding you the appointment we have on March 11-13, 2020 here in Toulouse with the 10th edition of the International Conference on Frailty and Sarcopenia Research. This is an international gathering of clinicians and researchers devoting their activities to these two geriatric conditions, frailty and sarcopenia. It will be done in Toulouse in France next year, and the deadline for the submission of the abstract is October 29th, 2019. Thanks a lot.